The largest voter turnout in the history of the UK wasn't to elect a prime minister. No, it was to vote on the 2016 referendum. Now, imagine 33 million people coming out to vote. Some wearing blue to show that they wanted to leave, some wearing yellow in support of staying in the European Union. The UK's position in the EU had been brought up in every debate for years. Now the voters were finally going to decide if it was better for them to stay or leave. The people in yellow were outnumbered by 1 million. That's 16 million voting to stay and 17 million voting to leave. As close of a call as ever. But the results were clear, and the Brexit strategy started. Those in support couldn't have been happier. They believed that it was finally time to put Britain first. They also thought that this marked a new age in the UK's history. Call it a lack of foresight or sensationalism, but the UK isn't thriving. So, what happened? How did we get here? What was promised and what was delivered? In June 2016, David Cameron, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, approached the lectern in Downing Street. With hundreds of cameras pointed at him and knowing that everyone in the UK was at the edge of their seats in the moment, Cameron made a shocking announcement. He was resigning from premiership. For some people, this was a happy surprise, and for some, it was a devastating one. In any case, the people of the UK were not expecting Cameron to up and leave only a year after being re-elected. So let's rewind for a minute and talk about what led to June 2016. Cameron became the youngest Prime Minister in the history of the UK in 2010, when he was elected at the age of 43. His model worked well for a few years, all throughout his first term actually. So well that the Conservative PM decided he wanted to try his hand out at re-election. And he won, which surprised everyone. So Cameron's back, and now he has to make good on the promises he's made during the general election. Cue the 2016 European Union referendum. Here's the deal. Cameron was strongly against the UK leaving the EU. He was part of the Remain group, which was surprising since most of his Conservative peers, including Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, were at the forefront of the Leave group. Now, everyone's thinking the same thing. Why did Cameron hold the 2016 referendum in the first place? Cameron was so sure that the people of the UK would vote to remain in the EU that not only would people commend him for his political foresight, but that his second term would go by smoothly. No one would question his thought process. He's been right before. He'll be right again. That was essentially his thought process. Leading up to the referendum, experts believed that the majority vote would be to leave. However, on the day of the referendum, it seemed like more people would want to stay. In any case, the numbers were tallied, and it looked like the Leave group was larger. By 2% though. 48% of the UK voted to remain, and 52% voted to leave. Embarrassed at the outcome, Cameron announced his resignation from premiership. And now we're all caught up till June 2016. Some political commentators claimed that in not so many words, Cameron said this was far too big of a mess for him to handle. What would happen to the group that vetoed to remain? What would happen to the financial sector? Would the EU even allow the UK to up and quit the coalition? That wasn't Cameron's concern anymore. How long do you think it actually took before the UK left the EU? 4 years. That's right, it took 4 years of talks, negotiations, and debates of a re-referendum before the UK decided it was time to leave. Over 33 million people came out to vote in the 2016 referendum, with 17 million voting to leave, 16 million voting to stay. Most of England, except Greater London, voted to leave, along with Wales. Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain. Results also showed that areas where there'd been an immigration boom of over 200% were 94% in favor of leaving the EU. And that's where we'll start talking about the aftermath of Brexit. How has it affected immigration? As a member of the EU, Britain allowed free movement to the UK by EU nations. There are 27 of them. Along with that, Britain also agreed to abide by the EU's immigration policy for non-EU residents. This included the distribution of immigrants from war-torn countries based on resources. The only problem here is that many people native to Britain believe they don't have those resources, at least not enough for themselves. Boris Johnson claimed that lower immigration would mean higher wages for the people of Britain. For the average person, this translated to more high-paying jobs being made available to the people of Britain. You'd think that this next part was where we'd tell you that immigration has finally gone down in the UK, but that's not the case. In fact, it hasn't gone down by any percent. If anything, from 2022 to 2023, that's 6 years after the referendum, the UK welcomed 700,000 immigrants, the largest in its history. Why? Because the UK went into it blind. At least that's what experts are claiming. It'd be fair to point out that there was a time when immigration went down since 2016. That was 2019, when COVID-19 brought immigration down to zero during lockdown. However, in the years since, it's only gone up. For one, there was a massive backlog that wasn't reported during COVID-19. Another reason would be the fact that the UK needs a skilled workforce. What about Johnson's promise to give higher wages? The people are still waiting on those wages. The only group that stopped immigrating to the UK was EU residents. Let's talk about numbers for a second. At the time of the referendum, about 170,000 immigrants entered from the EU and 190,000 from the rest of the world. The numbers are still close to 300,000. They've never gone down. They're just wholly from non-EU countries. The UK has implemented a strict take on immigration, but that hasn't really improved wages for the people native to Britain. And that's what many people who voted to leave are arguing today. Why aren't they richer? Which leads us to the next segment of this video. British PMs believe that the only deterrent for a smooth Brexit was the pandemic. What do you think? If you agree with the majority of financial experts, you'd say that COVID-19 was inadvertently the best thing that could have happened to the MPs who rallied to leave. It gave them the opportunity to blame something else for their lack of foresight. Britain is part of the G7, a group of industrialized economies that includes the United States. The 7 countries in this informal bloc all have one thing in common. They're some of the richest countries in the world. While COVID-19 had an impact on all of them, Britain was the only country whose GDP did not recover in the aftermath. In 2016, things were straightforward. Should we leave or stay? Fast forward to 2020, and it became, what if we still have a leg in the race? You see, any country can leave the EU, and the EU itself cannot vote out any nation. It can suspend their membership at most, but countries get to choose if they feel that staying is in their best interest. For the people of the UK, staying under EU rules was unacceptable, 52% to 48%. They wanted to leave the single market and enter the free trade market. This was believed to have a lasting impact on the UK's economy. In hindsight, it did have an impact, but a negative one. The pound sterling went down over 8% immediately after Brexit, which raised the cost of imports. The solution would have been to raise exports, but that didn't happen. Consequently, inflation went up by 3%, and the people of Britain, those who were promised higher wages, actually became poorer. But Britain was finally free, as the Leave supporters claimed. They believed that they'd finally put Britain first, and that this meant they'd eventually recover. To be fair, several MPs who called June 23rd Britain's unofficial Independence Day started to warn people. They claimed that there would be hard times ahead. Just how hard was the question? Again, Leave supporters thought they could deal with a few months to a year of hardship for the greater good. However, for inflation to go down, exports had to go back up, which meant that businesses had to operate at max capacity. The UK had just entered the free trade market, which many MPs claimed would help it in improving trade. Then why didn't trade go up? That's because while some of the UK's larger companies could easily afford to enter the free trade market, the smaller ones relied on the single market of the EU. Business owners now had a problem. Instead of shipping something out directly from Birmingham, signing a paper or two, things became different. Now, the UK had to clear customs for 27 different countries. Countries, by the way, that were some of the richest in the world. So, to mitigate the cost and resources it'd take to fill out paperwork, they started operating outside of the UK. This meant that they created warehouses in countries that were still part of the European Union. How did that help the UK? It didn't. Not only were businesses shutting down or relocating, but people were losing their jobs. Companies that relocated their warehouses to EU nations then started hiring people from those countries. These jobs have historically gone to the people of the UK. Businesses didn't catch up either. In fact, several businesses are still netting lower profits than before Brexit. That's because now they have to pay customs. Why is customs such a foreign word for the people of the EU? To answer this, you'd have to remember that the UK had been part of the EU since it was the EC, the European Commission, way back in the 1970s. It was one of the first nations to enter the coalition. It was also one of the EU's strongest candidates. Surely, it couldn't have been all that bad, right? Well, think about it this way. If you know there are countries that operate with the same rules, laws, and have the same status, why would you form a partnership with another? The UK isn't the richest country in the world, even if it's up there with some of the richest. It also doesn't provide the largest clientele. The fact is, it's just easier for businesses to focus on EU nations under the single market. So, as a member of the EU, the UK enjoyed a special status. Now, some commentators claim that there's a very real possibility that the EU is punishing the UK for leaving it high and dry. But shouldn't the government have seen it coming? Well, thanks for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and while you're here, check out some of our other videos.